The archives of the past hide stories so strange, they seem impossible, and yet they happened. Today, you'll discover 6 true legends where the line between history and mystery becomes almost invisible. From the Beast of Gévaudan, which terrorized 18th century France, to Spring-Heeled Jack, the masked figure who leapt across the rooftops of Victorian London. And you'll hear the tragic tale of Prince Don Carlos, heir to the Spanish throne, who died in a confinement as cruel as it was inexplicable. Relax, make yourself comfortable, and welcome to Behind the History. The Beast of Gévaudan, France. In the mid-18th century, under the reign of Louis XV, France was living through a period of deep uncertainty. The country was recovering from military defeats and a severe economic crisis, while the rural population suffered under heavy taxation and insecurity. Amid this tension, there were still regions almost forgotten by the crown-isolated lands of mountains and forests where royal authority barely reached. One such place was Gévaudan, in southern France, a cold, rugged land covered with dense woods, what we now know as Lozère. Life there moved between faith, hard labor, and fear of the wild beasts that roamed the countryside. Wolves were part of the landscape, but also of the imagination, symbols of evil and divine punishment that people saw in every misfortune. It was in this setting that, in the summer of 1764, a story began that still divides historians, scientists, and believers alike. It started with a single attack. A young shepherd girl was surprised by a strange creature in the forests near Langogne, and survived only because her herd fought it off. A few days later, another girl, Jeanne Boulet, just 14 years old, was found dead and mutilated near Saint-Étienne-de-Lugdarès. Her body showed terrible wounds, as if something had tried to devour her. From that moment, parish records began filling with the same grim phrase, devoured by a ferocious beast. Women and children vanished from the fields, and those who survived described the same monster, an animal the size of a calf, reddish in color, with an oversized head and unnatural strength. Fear spread quickly. Villages locked their doors at dusk, and the roads emptied. Rumors spoke of a creature immune to bullets, cunning, almost human. Local authorities, unable to contain the panic, turned to the army. Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, with a detachment of Royal Dragoons, organized armed patrols and massive hunts through the forests. He was joined by regional nobles such as the Marquis d'Upcher, and by seasoned hunters offering their services. The case soon reached Paris, and what had begun as a rural terror became a matter of state. King Louis XV himself ordered an intervention and sent his best marksman, François Antoine, to put an end to what people were already calling the Beast of Gévaudan. Thus began one of the most famous hunts in French history, a story where the line between fact and legend would become ever more blurred. Fear spread through Gévaudan with a speed never before seen. Within months, the attacks multiplied. Peasants began finding mutilated bodies along the roads, in the fields, and near the rivers. The victims were almost always young women and children. No one could explain it. Witnesses spoke of an enormous creature, reddish in color, with a dark back and a pale chest. They said it had the strength of a bull and the agility of a wolf, but moved with a strange intelligence, as if it understood the traps set for it. Some claimed it walked upright, others swore it leapt upon its victims from impossible distances. In the villages, people began to call it simply the Beast, as if that name alone could contain all the horror. Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel gathered hundreds of armed men and organized massive hunting parties. Hunters, peasants, and soldiers scoured the forests day and night, yet the creature always managed to escape. It left behind deep footprints, carcasses of animals, and trails of blood, but never a body. Frustration grew, and with it, the stories. The most superstitious claimed it was not a wolf, but a demon. Others said it was divine punishment for the sins of the people. Some priests even spoke of the end of times. In this climate of terror, the Parisian press began publishing reports about the Beast of the South, turning a local tragedy into national news. Pamphlets circulated from village to village, feeding the hysteria even further. By 1765, the number of dead had already surpassed 50 people. Official documents mention more than 70 attacks in less than a year. King Louis XV himself, alarmed by the scale of the panic, offered a royal reward to anyone who could slay the monster. He sent his personal huntsman, Francois Antoine, a veteran marksman who arrived in the region accompanied by his son and a team of experts. The operation was immense. Over 300 men, trained dogs, and traps spread across the territory. Yet, as the patrols advanced, the attacks continued, the beast always one step ahead. Neither the king's soldiers nor the local hunters could stop it. Each new killing confirmed the same terrifying truth. This was no ordinary animal. For the people of Gévaudan, there was no longer any doubt something not of this world was hiding in the forests of France. During 1765 and 1766, the terror reached its absolute peak. The entire region of Gévaudan lived under a constant shadow of fear. No one dared to travel alone, and the roads fell silent. Royal patrols combed the forests, yet the beast always reappeared elsewhere, as if it knew their movements in advance. In every village, the survivors told the same story. A creature with an elongated head, glowing eyes, and a jaw so powerful it could shatter bones with a single bite. They said it had a broad chest, reddish fur, and a tail that whipped the ground like a lash. Some even swore they had seen it rise on its hind legs, leaping upon its victims with a sound that was more a roar than a howl. The press began publishing illustrations of the beast, depicting it less as a wolf and more as a mythological monster. Naturalists tried to explain the phenomenon. Some claimed it was a hyena escaped from a menagerie. Others that it was a mutant hybrid between a dog and a wolf. The villagers, however, had no doubts. To them, it was a creature of evil. Each new victim strengthened the belief that the animal was protected by a supernatural force. Prayers mingled with weapons. Hunters went into the woods carrying saints' medals and bullets blessed by priests. The entire country followed the story as though it were a war between faith and hell. On the 21st of September 1765, after months of relentless pursuit, the king's gunbearer, Francois Antoine, managed to kill a massive wolf in the forest of Chazes, near Saint-Julien-des-Champs. The animal measured over 6 feet long and weighed nearly 130 pounds, far larger than any ordinary wolf. Its hide was sent to Versailles, where it was displayed before King Louis XV and the royal court, and the hunter was honored with rewards and praise. Newspapers triumphantly declared the nightmare over. The Beast of Gévaudan is dead. But the peace did not last. Only weeks later, new attacks were reported even more brutal than before. The victims bore the same marks, the same claw wounds and bite patterns. The peasants understood what the court refused to admit. The real beast was still alive. And with that realization, fear returned to the forests deeper and darker than ever. The death of the great wolf slain by the royal gunbearer brought a brief respite to Gévaudan, but not the peace everyone had hoped for. For a few weeks, the region regained a sense of calm. The soldiers were withdrawn, the rewards were paid, and the newspapers proudly proclaimed that the monster had been slain. Yet the truth was different. Barely 2 months later, In the winter of 1765, the killings began again. New victims were found near La Bessière, St. Mary, and Paulhac and Margeride, attacked with the same savagery as before. Witnesses insisted it was the same creature, the same reddish fur, the same brutal strength, the same way of tearing at the throat and dragging the bodies into the woods. Some even claimed to have seen two creatures together, fueling suspicion that there had never been just one beast, but a pair or an entire litter. Panic swept the region once more. Families refused to let their children outside, herds were guarded by armed men, and the roads emptied again. Priests preached of divine punishment, warning that the moral corruption of the people had brought the curse upon them. Meanwhile, the provincial authorities found themselves in an impossible position. The king had officially declared the case closed, yet the deaths continued to mount. The credibility of the crown began to falter. In a France already growing distrustful of authority, the idea that not even the king could defeat a single beast became a symbol of royal failure. By 1766, the affair was no longer a local issue, it had become a national embarrassment. That was when the hunt returned to the hands of the locals. The noble Marquis d'Abergele, a respected man and expert on the region, gathered the best marksmen from nearby villages to organize new patrols. Among them was an experienced farmer named Jean Chastel, who had taken part in the first hunts years earlier. Chastel was a reserved, deeply religious man, well known in the area for his steady aim. On the 19th of June 1767, while patrolling the forest of Montmouchet in southern Gévaudan, the final encounter took place. According to the chronicles, Chastel waited in silence, rosary in one hand and musket in the other. When the creature emerged from the undergrowth, he knelt, recited a prayer, and fired point blank. The bullet, it was said, was a lead round blessed by a priest, forged together with a medal of the Virgin Mary. The beast fell instantly. The body was examined by regional officials. It measured nearly 2 meters in length, with an oversized head, broad chest, and unusually large claws. Inside its stomach, they found human remains and pieces of clothing. The carcass was taken first to Saugues, then to Versailles, where it was presented as final proof before the royal court. From that moment, the attacks ceased completely. The case was declared closed in the royal records, and Jean Chastel was rewarded for his bravery. But the story did not end there. No one could ever agree on what the creature truly was. Some naturalists identified it as an enormous, unknown species of wolf. Others claimed it was an African hyena, or even a human-bred hybrid. Yet for the people of Gévaudan, there was no doubt at all. Jean Chastel had slain the demon of Gévaudan. With the creature's death in 1767, Gévaudan finally found peace, but the mystery never faded. The attacks had stopped, yes, but the questions remained. For years, peasants kept speaking of the beast, of the rituals, the prayers, and the blessed bullets. No one forgot the more than 100 dead, nor the humiliation of the king's army, powerless before an unseen enemy. In the villages, the elders whispered that evil had not been destroyed, only contained, and that the forest still held its shadow. The story was passed down from generation to generation, becoming a collective scar in the memory of the land. As centuries passed, researchers and historians tried to uncover what had truly happened. Some supported the Great Lone Wolf theory, an exceptionally large and aggressive animal that, deprived of a mate or territory, turned to attack humans. Others spoke of a hyena escaped from some aristocrat's private collection, an exotic creature unknown to the region that had survived by hunting livestock. There were even those who suspected something far more human, a series of murders disguised as animal attacks, crimes hidden behind the fear that gripped the countryside. Yet none of these theories ever fit perfectly with the witness accounts, timelines, or the scale of the events. The truth remained trapped between record and legend, between reason and fear. Today, more than 2 centuries later, the Beast of Gévaudan still lives on in France's collective memory. In Lozère, museums and tourist trails mark the places where the attacks occurred. Books, films, and studies have been devoted to it, and its figure has become a symbol of the ancient fear that has followed humankind since the dawn of the forests. It represents the border between the known and the inexplicable, between faith and science. Some see it as a reflection of an age ruled by superstition, others as an eternal warning about violence and the fragility of human order. Yet, in the silence of the southern French woods, some still claim to hear, from time to time, a faint, distant roar carried through the trees by the wind. And they say that when that happens, Gévaudan remembers its beast. Spring-Heeled Jack, England. By the late 1830s, London was a city on the verge of collapse. The Industrial Revolution had transformed its landscape into a maze of smoke, factories, and narrow alleys. Thousands of people arrived each year from the countryside in search of work, filling the streets with poverty, beggars, and crime. The southern and eastern districts, like Battersea and Whitechapel, were shrouded in darkness and fear. There was no modern police force like the one we know today. Security was minimal, and night patrols could barely contain the thefts and assaults. In that climate of uncertainty, the line between crime and the supernatural began to blur. When reality became unbearable, people sought explanations in what they couldn't understand. The press played a key role in this atmosphere. Sensationalist newspapers competed for headlines that mixed real events with rumors, and any strange occurrence could become front-page news. The collective imagination fed on a dark, dangerous London where threats lurked around every corner. It was the perfect breeding ground for a myth. In the outskirts of the city, witnesses began to speak of a man who appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. They said he was dressed in black, that his silhouette stood out against the sky like a shadow, and that he could leap over walls with impossible agility. The first documented case appeared in 1837, when a young woman from Battersea reported being attacked by a hooded figure who tore off her veil and then bounded away with a huge leap as if he had springs on his feet. Within days, similar stories surfaced in Clapham, Wandsworth, and Peckham. The authorities, baffled, didn't know whether they were facing a criminal or a collective hallucination. The public, however, began to call him by a name that would soon dominate the headlines: Spring-Heeled Jack. And so, in a city already living under the shadow of misery and fear, a figure was born, one destined to become one of the most chilling legends of Victorian England. The case that cemented Spring-Heeled Jack's fame took place in January 1838 in the Old Ford district, east of London. The victim was Jane Alsop, and one 8-year-old who lived with her family in a country house near Bearbinder Lane. One foggy night, someone knocked on the door claiming to be a police officer. He said he had captured the mysterious Jack and asked for a lamp to light the way. Trusting him, Jane handed over a lit candle. At that moment, the stranger threw open his cloak and blew a burst of blue flame into her face, burning her neck and clothes. Terrified, Jane screamed for help while the attacker tried to grab her with cold, metallic hands. She managed to break free and ran back inside the house. Her account was published by several newspapers, including the Times and the Morning Chronicle, and it sparked a wave of public hysteria. The Jane Alsop incident wasn't the only one. Just days later, a woman named Lucy Scales from Limehouse reported a similar attack. She claimed she saw a tall, thin figure dressed in a tight-fitting coat who, as he passed her, spewed some kind of gas or flame that temporarily blinded her. Her brother, who was with her, testified that the attacker moved with unnatural agility. Both cases were believed by the police to have been committed by the same individual. Within weeks, a consistent description began circulating across London. A man of athletic build, with a pale face, glowing eyes like embers, a metallic helmet, and sharp claws. Some witnesses swore that the flames coming from his mouth were real. Others thought it was some chemical substance, perhaps phosphorus or flammable gas, that created the illusion. The press seized the story. London newspapers began publishing detailed reports, illustrations, and contradictory testimonies that only deepened the mystery. The term Spring-Heeled Jack appeared for the first time in the London news, referring to the attacker's almost acrobatic ability to leap over walls more than 6 feet high. Within months, his name was known across the country. Popular pamphlets and neighbourhood gazettes mixed fact with fiction. Some claimed he was a bored nobleman disguised to terrorize the poor. Others described him as a demonic being from hell, sent to punish London's sinners. The fear was so intense that night patrols were ordered to increase security in the southern districts, but no one ever caught him. Each new attack only reinforced the belief that Spring-Heeled Jack was not just a criminal, he was something impossible to capture. The scandal caused by the attacks led to the direct involvement of London's authorities. In February 1838, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, received a flood of letters describing similar sightings in different parts of the city. During a public hearing at Mansion House, Cowan read the testimonies aloud before the press, admitting that the case was causing a genuine social disturbance. The Metropolitan Police launched a formal investigation, but the lack of solid evidence made progress impossible. Some suspects belonged to influential families, among them Henry, the Marquess of Waterford, an Irish nobleman known for his cruel pranks and taste for scandal. Rumours spread that he and a group of friends, armed with lanterns and masks, roamed the streets terrifying pedestrians for fun. Although no formal charges were ever filed, the suspicion of his involvement lingered for decades. As the months went by, reports of attacks attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack multiplied. Sightings came from Kensington, Hammersmith, Ealing, and Lewisham, and later from industrial cities like Sheffield, Manchester, and Liverpool. In every account, the description was the same: a man dressed in black, wearing a cloak or long coat, who could leap over impossible walls and vanish into the darkness. By 1843, the sensationalist press began treating the story in a theatrical tone, publishing illustrations that depicted Jack as a demonic figure with horns and flames coming from his mouth. In truth, many of these supposed encounters were likely imitations or exaggerations, but people believed in his existence as firmly as they feared crime or urban disease. It was then that Spring-Heeled Jack stopped being merely an attacker and became a living legend. To London's poor, he represented the evil lurking in the streets. To Victorian moralists, he was a symbol of the chaos that modernity had unleashed. He was said to possess supernatural powers, the ability to breathe fire, resist bullets, and even change shape. His image inspired theatre plays, street ballads, and moral pamphlets portraying him as a divine punishment for sinners. Between 1838 and 1845, Spring-Heeled Jack had already become a figure of urban folklore, a reflection of a society gripped by fear and uncertainty. And although the real attacks eventually declined, the myth only grew stronger, fueled by headlines, rumours, and the imagination of a nation obsessed with the unknown. Victorian society reacted to Spring-Heeled Jack with a mix of terror and fascination. In an era defined by moral repression, fear of disorder, and an obsession with public decency, this figure seemed to embody all the anxieties of the modern city. Newspapers of the time described him as the invisible enemy of London, a being who defied both human and divine law. Sunday sermons turned him into a moral warning, a punishment for those who strayed from virtue. On the streets, mothers invoked his name to scare disobedient children, and travelling theatre troupes began performing plays about him. His image appeared everywhere in illustrations, pamphlets, and broadsheets sold at markets. Spring-Heeled Jack no longer belonged to crime reports alone. He had become a reflection of the collective subconscious of industrial England. During the 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds, the sightings moved northward. In cities like Sheffield, Liverpool, and Birmingham, night workers claimed to have seen him leaping across rooftops or darting through alleyways. Some police reports even described metallic footprints on walls, as if the attacker wore mechanical devices on his feet. Witnesses came from all walks of life, yet their stories were strikingly similar. A human figure capable of impossible jumps, vanishing in seconds. In 1877, soldiers stationed at Aldershot, a military base southwest of London, reported seeing a creature that bounded over guard posts and disappeared without a trace. The army even opened an official file on the incident, but no explanation was ever found. That event proved that the legend had transcended popular superstition. Even trained men of discipline believed they had seen England's acrobatic ghost. As years passed, the phenomenon took on a more complex cultural dimension. By the late 19th century, Spring-Heeled Jack appeared in illustrated magazines and in cheap serialized fiction known as penny dreadfuls, the same publications that popularized Sweeney Todd and the Phantom of London. There, he was portrayed as a dark avenger, half hero, half demon, punishing criminals in the city's slums. His character evolved from monster to vigilante, foreshadowing the archetypes of modern comic book heroes. Even as late as 1904, more than 60 years after his first appearance, newspapers in Liverpool and Everton reported new sightings of a masked man leaping across warehouse rooftops and vanishing into the night. No evidence or arrests followed, but the myth once again made headlines, proving that Spring-Heeled Jack did not belong only to the past. He had become a permanent shadow in the British imagination, the embodiment of a fear that neither progress nor science could ever fully dispel. Over time, historians and criminologists have tried to find a rational explanation for the mystery. Some argue that Spring-Heeled Jack was simply a prankster with unusually advanced technical resources for his era, perhaps using a spring-loaded harness, a gas or phosphorus lamp to create the illusion of fire, and a metal mask to distort and amplify his voice. The most common theory points to the Marquess of Waterford, known for his cruelty, eccentricity, and scandalous behavior. After his death in 1859, the attacks dropped dramatically, reinforcing the suspicion that he had been behind them. Other researchers believe it was a series of imitators who kept the myth alive for decades, taking advantage of public hysteria and the poor communication between distant regions of the country. In truth, none of the theories were ever proven, and Spring-Heeled Jack remains suspended between history and legend. Culturally, his influence was enormous. By the mid-19th century, his image had inspired dozens of sensational publications, from cheap serialized booklets to full theatrical productions depicting him either as a vengeful demon or a nocturnal hero who punished the wicked. Scholars of popular literature regard him as a precursor to the modern superhero, a figure combining anonymity, double identity, and justice outside the law. In fact, early illustrations of Spring-Heeled Jack, with his cape, high boots, and fiery eyes foreshadow the very aesthetic that would, a century later, define characters like Batman and the Shadow. His story also indirectly influenced the creation of the Jack the Ripper myth, another urban phantom that turned London's fear into national obsession. Today, Spring-Heeled Jack remains one of the most enduring enigmas of British folklore. He continues to appear in novels, comics, video games, and stage adaptations, always as a symbol of the unexplainable lurking within the modern city. He represents a distinctly modern kind of fear, not of forest monsters, but of the stranger waiting just around the corner. In his impossible leap, one can sense the anxiety of an age torn between science and superstition, progress and dread. Ultimately, Spring-Heeled Jack was the mirror of a divided London caught between the gaslight's glow and the shadows of its own fears. And perhaps that's why, more than a century later, his figure still endures, not as a man or a demon, but as the eternal echo of a city that learned to live with its monsters. The Rat Man of Paris. By the mid-19th century, Paris was changing at an unprecedented pace. Napoleon III had ordered a complete transformation of the city, and Baron Haussmann was leading an ambitious public works project. Wide boulevards, open squares, and a new sewer system designed to clean and modernize the capital. But beneath that surface of progress lay another world invisible to most and reeking of decay. Underground, the old medieval sewers intertwined with the new tunnels under construction, forming a damp, dark labyrinth where the stench of rot never disappeared. Down there flowed the city's waste, the refuse of its markets, and the forgotten remains of urban life that Paris preferred not to see. In that setting was born one of the strangest stories of 19th century France, the legend of the Rat Man, known in the press as L'Homme aux Rats. The first rumors came from workers tasked with cleaning the drains of the Seine. They claimed that in the deepest parts of the sewers, where the dim glow of oil lamps barely reached, a human figure moved silently through the tunnels, someone who never returned to the surface. Some believed he was a beggar who had found refuge underground. Others thought he was a fugitive or a madman who had made the sewers his home. Yet, this was not mere journalistic invention. Police records of the time mention a real individual, sighted repeatedly in the tunnels near the Aile de la Cité and the slums of Les Halles. Paris at that time was a city divided in two. Above ground, the shining symbol of the new empire. Below, the dark, wet underworld where the forgotten survived. Beggars, thieves, sewer cleaners, and scrap scavengers. Down there lived the rats too, by the millions, forming part of the city's hidden ecosystem. In that shadowy environment, the idea of a man living among the rodents seemed not only possible, but almost natural. Newspapers began to report on him with a mix of fascination and disgust. Le Petit Journal described him as the ghost of the sewers, while police reports referred to him as an unknown vagrant who maintains contact with the animals. And so began the story of the Rat Man of Paris, a figure as real in the archives as he was mythical in the collective memory. The first descriptions of the mysterious Homme aux Rats came from the men who worked below Paris, the égoutiers, sewer workers responsible for cleaning the tunnels and keeping the city's channels flowing. These were men hardened by darkness and stench, yet even they spoke of this strange figure with a kind of uneasy respect. They said he was thin and wiry, his face hidden beneath a thick beard, and his eyes bright, almost animal-like. He always carried an oil lantern hanging from his chest and wore mud-stained rags. Workers often saw him dragging a basket filled with stale bread and scraps of meat, which he would leave by the side of a tunnel before disappearing into the deeper passages. No one knew how he had come to live there, nor how long he had been among the shadows. Some claimed he was a deserter, others a beggar the city had forgotten. But all agreed on one thing: the rats seemed to follow him as if they recognized him. Witnesses swore that when he passed, the rats moved aside without fear. Even the most experienced égoutiers told stories of how, when the man whistled, swarms of rats would emerge from cracks in the walls and surround him, moving in step with his pace. This strange bond inspired both fear and fascination. Paris knew rats well. They were a constant plague, feeding on the waste of the great market of Les Halles and multiplying endlessly. The city paid bounties for every rat tail turned in, and rat catchers, a real profession at the time, patrolled the tunnels with trained dogs. Yet no one dared venture into the section where this man lived. The workers said that in his territory, rats didn't flee from humans, they obeyed. The story began to make its way above ground. In 1853, La Presse published a short note about a vagrant living in the drains who has tamed the rodents. Soon after, Le Petit Journal expanded the tale, presenting him as a symbol of Parisian misery, a man who has found in darkness a kingdom of his own. The articles captured the public's imagination, and fact quickly blended with legend. Some of the more sensational papers claimed he could communicate with animals through inhuman sounds, or that an army of rats followed him wherever he went. Readers were divided. Some saw him as a scientific curiosity, others as a threat to the modern, orderly city Haussmann was building above. In a society obsessed with cleanliness and control, the existence of a man living peacefully among thousands of rats was almost a symbolic insult, a reminder that beneath the splendor of the boulevards, the dark heart of Paris still beat, hidden and alive. The growing public fascination with the Homme aux rats soon caught the attention of the Paris police prefecture. Alarmed by workers' reports and the persistence of the press, the authorities decided to act. In 1855, during a routine inspection of the tunnels near Pont Neuf, a group of officers and sewer workers received orders to locate the mysterious inhabitant of the underground. Their goal was to identify, detain, and determine whether he posed any risk to public health or to the massive sanitation works then transforming the city. Officials feared he might be stealing food from storage areas along the Seine or from municipal warehouses, crimes considered serious in an expanding Paris. The operation took place on an autumn dawn. The men descended with lanterns and trained dogs, guided by the sound of running water beneath the streets. For hours, they searched through the tunnels without success. They found only scraps of bread, bones, and marks on the walls, as if someone had scraped the plaster with metal or stone. Just as they were about to give up, one of the workers claimed to see a distant light, accompanied by a sharp whistle. When they advanced, a deafening noise filled the air, a collective shriek, as though thousands of rats were answering at once. The lanterns shook, the dogs panicked, and the group instinctively backed away. No one dared to go farther. The official report concluded simply, the individual was not found. However, unusual animal activity was detected in the area. That brief sentence would be the final official mention of the case in police records. The popular version, far more vivid, quickly took over. In the following days, rumors spread across the city. Some claimed the officers had found the man, but when they tried to capture him, the rats defended him, attacking in a massive, ferocious swarm. Others said that, when cornered, he whistled, and the animals surrounded him, covering his body completely before vanishing together into the darkness. The image was so powerful that it spread through pamphlets, cafes, and public conversations. The vagabond devoured, or perhaps protected by his own creatures, swallowed by the bowels of Paris. In the public imagination, he was no longer an anonymous beggar. He had become the king of the rats, the invisible ruler of the underworld. The incident ignited debates among moralists, journalists, and thinkers. For some, it represented the ultimate consequence of social inequality, a man cast out of civilization who had found refuge in filth. For others, it was a metaphor for the decay hidden beneath progress. In the city's literary cafes, people spoke of him as a symbol of the modern metropolis. Beneath the gaslit boulevards, an unseen multitude of the poor, of animals, of waste continued to live beyond all law and recognition. The rats that obeyed the man became a mirror of society itself, orderly, disciplined, yet condemned to the dark. From that moment on, The name Homocrats was etched into Parisian memory not as a criminal, but as a shadow that reminded the city of what its imperial splendor tried to forget. The myth of the Homocrats soon took on a life of its own in a city that was beginning to view progress with suspicion. Paris, transformed by Haussmann into a model of order, cleanliness, and symmetry, hid beneath its surface everything the new empire preferred to ignore: poverty, disease, and the remnants of the old medieval city. In that context, the figure of the Ratman began to take on a symbolic meaning. He represented the reverse side of progress, the dark reflection of the city's gleaming boulevards. While cafes, theaters, and avenues opened above ground, below remained a world of dampness, darkness, and silence. The vagabond who lived among rats was, to many, the embodiment of what Paris denied the forgotten humanity that survived on the margins. As the story spread, different parts of society gave it their own meaning. For moralists, he was a warning about the dangers of decay and spiritual neglect. For Republicans and writers critical of the imperial regime, he symbolized social injustice, a man forced to live among animals because society had cast him out of the light. The sewer workers saw him almost as a protective spirit, someone who knew the tunnels better than anyone and who, they claimed, whistled to warn them of collapses or floods. His name also began to circulate among medical students and naturalists who were fascinated by his supposed mastery over rats, creatures that, despite their reputation, had become subjects of scientific study for their adaptability and survival instincts. Literature, always quick to recognize symbols, soon embraced the myth. Writers like Eugene Sue, author of The Mysteries of Paris, 1842, 1843, had already opened the path to exploring the urban underworld. Though his novel predated the case, many later editions included veiled references to the Man of the Sewers, adapting the figure of the Homoc rats to the popular imagination. But it was Victor Hugo who gave the myth its lasting resonance. In Les Miserables, 1862, the famous episode where Jean Valjean escapes through the sewers reflects, with striking realism, the era's fascination with that subterranean world, a world that symbolized the hidden conscience of the city. Contemporary critics quickly noted the connection: the man dragging his body through mud and rats to save a life, while the world above despises him, directly evoked the mythical creature of the underground. Hugo, though he never named him, was well aware of the police reports and newspaper accounts circulating through Paris at the time. By the late 19th century, the myth had become fully established. In the markets, street vendors told the tale to children as a warning. If you go too close to the river, the Rat Man will take you with him. In working-class neighborhoods, people said his whistle could still be heard on rainy nights, blending with the murmur of water through the drains. Among intellectuals, his image took on a philosophical dimension, the symbol of a human being adapting to the inhuman, finding meaning in what society discards. Thus, the Homocrats evolved from a mere vagrant into an allegory of the modern city, a reminder that, even beneath the surface of progress, there is always a subterranean world filled with life, memory, and shadows. The last official mention of the Homos rats appears in police archives from 1861, within a report detailing incidents in the central sewers of the Seine. In a short note, written in nearly illegible ink, it read, "Sujet non retrouvé, présumé disparu dans les égouts. Subject not found, presumed disappeared in the sewers." That brief line was both the only bureaucratic proof of his existence and the end of his documented trail. From that moment, the story crossed irreversibly into the realm of legend. No later witness could verify his presence, though every now and then, sewer workers claimed to hear a distant whistle or see shadows moving through the tunnels. Over the years, the figure of the Rat Man became indistinguishable from the sewers themselves, part of the hidden system that kept the city alive, yet invisible to all. During the 20th century, the myth was reborn in new forms. In the 1920 seconds, crime columnists rediscovered the story in papers like Le Matin and Paris Soir, portraying it as a Gothic tale from old Paris. In the 1950 seconds, writer Claude Signol, a specialist in French urban legends, included it in his collections of everyday supernatural stories, describing the Rat Man as a spirit of the depths, half man, half shadow. Later, film and radio revived his image, adapting it to the new urban anxieties of the modern age. Movies and documentaries explored the hidden underworld of Paris's sewers, where the Homot rats reappeared as a metaphor for loneliness and human abandonment. In 1984, a France 3 television program titled Le Monde Souterrain de Paris aired an episode about the city's 19th century underground galleries, briefly mentioning the legendary sewer dweller. By then, his existence had already become part of the collective imagination, a symbolic presence, as familiar as it was unseen. Today, the Rat Man endures as one of Paris's most persistent urban legends. During guided tours of the city's sewers, guides still mention him in whispers, as if saying his name aloud might offend the depths. Historians interpret him as a boundary figure somewhere between human and animal, between poverty and survival, between the illuminated surface and the darkness that sustains the city. His story reminds us that cities are not only built of stone and progress, but also of the things they hide. And beneath the splendor of Paris, in the constant murmur of water flowing under the boulevards, one can still imagine hearing the faint echo of a distant whistle, that of the man who chose to live among shadows and made the rats his only companions. Thus ended, or perhaps never truly ended, the story of the Homot rats, the invisible inhabitant of Paris's underground heart. The Walden Nun of San Placido, Spain. In the heart of Golden Age Madrid, when its streets were still made of mud and religious processions mingled with the noise of the markets, a story emerged that would forever blur the line between faith and fear. It was the Spain of King Philip IV, a powerful monarchy haunted by superstition, guilt, and the weight of religion. In those days, spiritual life infused every corner of the city. Convents multiplied on the outskirts, welcoming young women from noble families seeking redemption or refuge. Some entered by vocation, others by duty or disgrace. Behind the walls of enclosure, prayer coexisted with repression and the sacred with the forbidden. It was in this setting that the convent of San Placido was born, one of the most secretive and enigmatic places in Madrid. The convent was founded in 1623 by Doña Teresa Valle de la Cerda, a lady of aristocratic lineage who decided to devote her fortune to religious life. Her intention was to create a model house of retreat, a sanctuary for noblewomen wishing to consecrate themselves to God. But from its earliest years, the place acquired an ambiguous reputation. Neighbors whispered about lights burning late at night, chants echoing past midnight, and shadowy figures moving beneath the arches of the cloister. Its confessor, Geronimo de Villanueva, a learned cleric and protonotary of the Council of Aragon, was a man of immense influence at court, a direct protege of King Philip IV. Under his direction, San Placido became an unusual convent, known for its intense rituals and its fervor that bordered on the excessive. On the surface, the community appeared to be a model of devotion. The nuns prayed for hours, scourged themselves in penitence, and fasted frequently. Yet something disturbing began to seep through the walls. In spiritual diaries of the time, there are mentions of ecstasies, visions, and trances that went far beyond the norm. Some nuns claim to have felt the presence of supernatural beings during prayer. Others spoke of strange noises in the cells, of laughter echoing through the corridors, and of an energy that swept through the convent like a cold breath. To the court, San Placido remained a symbol of virtue, but within the shadows of its cloister, one of the most unsettling religious scandals of the 17th century was about to unfold. It all began with the visions of the prioress, Sister Maria de la Visitación, a charismatic, respected, and deeply devout woman who claimed to communicate with angels and receive divine messages during her prayers. In an age when mystical ecstasies were seen as signs of holiness, her reputation grew quickly. The other nuns revered her, and her confessor, Jerónimo de Villanueva, believed her to be a soul chosen by God. Yet, what first appeared to be a heavenly gift soon revealed a far more troubling face. Some sisters claimed that during her trances, the prioress's voice would change, growing deeper, slower, and that she spoke in Latin phrases none of them understood. Others swore they had seen her levitate or twist into impossible positions, as if an invisible force had taken hold of her body. The records of the Inquisition later described these scenes in cautious terms: manifestations of fervor, doubtful possessions, movements contrary to nature. The confessor, convinced these phenomena were signs of divine presence, began performing exorcisms inside the convent secretly and without official authorization. He gathered the nuns at night for long sessions of prayer, penance, and self-flagellation. According to testimonies collected years later, these ceremonies blurred the line between the sacred and the profane. Prayers were mingled with physical contact, touches, and caresses that Villanueva justified as acts of purification. Some nuns, terrified of being possessed by the devil, submitted willingly, believing they were obeying God's will. Others, fearful and confused, refused to take part. That was when the first signs of collective hysteria appeared: uncontrollable sobbing, fainting, screams echoing through the choir, and shared visions. The sisters said they saw shadows gliding along the walls, felt cold hands on their skin, or heard voices whispering prayers backward. What had begun as mystic fervor had turned into a nightmare. In 1628, an anonymous denunciation reached the ears of the Inquisition of Toledo, warning of strange goings-on inside San Placido. The report spoke of indecent practices, pacts with the devil, and acts contrary to the purity of faith. The scandal was so grave that the Holy Office sent a tribunal to Madrid to investigate. During interrogation, several nuns confessed they had been tempted by the evil one in the form of their own confessor. One nun testified that Villanueva told them the devil could be purified through the bodies of the chosen. Another claimed to have seen him performing rituals with inverted prayers and unfamiliar symbols. The inquisitors, horrified, ordered his arrest, but the case soon became a political crisis. Jerónimo de Villanueva was no ordinary priest. He was a close friend of King Philip IV and a protege of the Count Duke of Olivares, the most powerful man in Spain. For the first time, the Inquisition faced a case where faith, power, and scandal intertwined in a way no one could control. The arrest of licentiate Jerónimo de Villanueva shook the foundations of power in Madrid. No one had ever dared to question a man so close to the throne. He was protonotary of the Council of Aragon, confessor to powerful ladies of the court, and a regular figure in the circle of King Philip IV. His detention by the Inquisition in 1628 was a direct blow to the very heart of royal authority. The inquisitors accused him of having led the nuns of San Placido into heretical rituals disguised as exorcisms. During interrogation, Villanueva defended himself, claiming his intentions had been pure, that he had only sought to free them from the devil. and that the physical gestures and bodily penances were part of the spiritual struggle. But the nuns' testimonies were devastating. Some claimed the priest had touched them to expel evil, that he had ordered them to undress during the sessions, and that he had recited prayers with forbidden words. The surviving records of the trial speak cautiously of illicit rites of purification, a euphemism which, in the language of the Inquisition, meant acts of impurity. News of the scandal spread rapidly through Madrid. The city's elite whispered in the corridors of the Royal Alcazar, while anonymous pamphlets circulated among servants and merchants. Some claimed the convent was a nest of witches, others that the nuns had been victims of madness and fanaticism. The affair threatened to stain the name of the king himself, for Villanueva was one of his protégés. Under mounting pressure from both public opinion and his powerful minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, Philip IV decided to intervene. He ordered the suspension of the proceedings and arranged for Villanueva to be transferred to a convent outside Madrid for spiritual retreat. It was a political maneuver. The Inquisition had to close the case without humiliating the crown, but without discrediting itself either. The result was a trial without condemnation and without absolution, a legal void that buried the truth beneath a layer of official silence. After the king's intervention, the convent of San Placido was temporarily closed. The nuns involved were sent to other religious houses or confined in isolation. Sister Maria de la Visitación, the visionary prioress, was stripped of her authority and forced into perpetual silence. Her spiritual writings were seized and reviewed by censors. Every trace of the scandal had to disappear. For years, the convent remained under strict surveillance, forbidden to accept new novices. What had begun as an outbreak of mystical fervor ended as a forbidden story. In the archives of the Holy Office, the case of San Placido was classified as a reserved matter, a label reserved for the most delicate intersections of faith and power. From that moment on, the walls of the convent kept a secret that neither time nor renovation could erase a dense silence that, over the centuries, transformed into legend. More than 2 centuries after the scandal, the silence surrounding the convent of San Placido was broken once again. In 1893, during restoration work on the aging, building its walls cracked and part of its structure in ruin, workers made a discovery that would forever change the convent's reputation. While demolishing an inner wall of the old cloister, one of the men noticed that his hammer struck hollow. When he struck harder, the plaster gave way, revealing a sealed chamber barely 2 meters long. Inside were human bones, fragments of a Benedictine habit, and a rusted iron cross resting beside what appeared to have been a small prayer cell. News of the find spread through Madrid within hours. Newspapers such as El Liberal and La Época published cautious notes about it, but the rumor quickly took on a life of its own. People said the hidden room was the cell of a nun walled up alive. The discovery came at a time when Spain was rediscovering its own dark legends. Tales of walled-in penitents, spectral processions, and haunted convents already haunted the popular imagination, but the case of San Placido was different. This time, there was physical evidence, bones, old walls, and a building with a documented history of inquisitorial scandal. Local historians sought rational explanations. Some claimed the space had been a punishment cell used for prolonged penance during the 17th century crisis. Others suggested it was an improvised burial, a secret resting place for a nun who died during an epidemic. Yet the version that prevailed was the most macabre, that of a religious sacrifice, a nun who had been entombed alive to purify the sins of the convent and appease the demon said to linger within its walls. Oral tradition soon wove its own version of the story. According to accounts circulating in late 19th century Madrid, after the trials and public disgrace, the surviving nuns of San Placido lived in terror of being dissolved as a community. Convinced they had been punished by God, one of them, whether out of fanaticism or obedience, offered herself as atonement. She was sealed within the convent walls, with only a small opening through which bread and water were passed for the first few days. It was said that she recited psalms until her voice failed. When the prayers ceased, the wall was sealed forever. No official record of this event exists, but the 19th century discovery seemed to confirm it in the minds of the people of Madrid. From that moment on, the tale of the walled-in nun of San Placido ceased to be just an inquisitorial story. It became a living legend, half sin, half atonement, that still seems to whisper through the silent stones of the convent today. Since the discovery of the sealed cell, the convent of San Placido has carried an unsettling reputation. Neighbors began to speak of inexplicable sounds echoing through the night. Some of the workers who had taken part in the renovations claimed they heard rhythmic knocks on the walls, as if someone were calling from within. Others described feeling a cold, silent presence while passing through the old chapel, or hearing female voices whispering prayers that seemed to come from nowhere. The nuns who still lived in the convent preferred to remain silent, but more than one confessed to hearing fingernails scraping against stone or waking with the sense that someone was walking beside their bed. Chroniclers of the late 19th century dismissed these accounts as superstition, but as the decades passed, the phenomenon became an inseparable part of the place's identity. What had once been a case of inquisitorial history had turned into one of Madrid's most haunting tales of entombment. Throughout the 20th century, the story of the walled-in nun survived thanks to curiosity seekers, chroniclers, and lovers of the occult. Local guides would tell visitors that on moonless nights, the air inside the church turned icy cold, and that a faint murmur accompanied the tolling of the bells. Paranormal investigators tried to capture the sounds on recorders, but without clear results. In the 1,970 seconds, the area of the discovery was briefly reopened, only to be sealed again by order of the religious community. The nuns, still living under strict enclosure, allow very few outsiders to enter the church. They say that on winter nights, when the city falls silent, a faint whisper can sometimes be heard from the street, a trembling voice reciting a prayer, always the same psalm, always the same lament. Over time, San Placido became more than a convent. It became a symbol of the darker side of Spain's golden age, a period when devotion could blur into guilt and penitence could verge on madness. Its story bridges the gap between documented history and the inexplicable, between the human and the supernatural. Today, before its sober facade, few passers-by realize that behind those walls lies a cell that once served as a tomb, a prayer, and a punishment. The legend of the walled-in nun endures as a reminder that the line between faith and horror can be as thin as a wall of lime and stone, and that sometimes the holiest walls conceal the darkest secrets of history. The Ghost Train of Abergele, Wales. By the mid-19th century, the railway was the pride of the British Empire. No other nation had built such an extensive or advanced network. Thousands of miles of track-connected mines, ports, and booming industrial cities. Trains had become a symbol of progress, modernity, and mankind's mastery over nature. In Wales, the line connecting Chester and Holyhead, inaugurated in 1850, represented a crucial milestone, a direct link between England and Ireland, vital for trade and for the steady stream of passengers crossing the sea. But its route was narrow and winding, hugging cliffs and hillsides, which made it one of the most dangerous in the country. Along that line, near the small coastal town of Abergele, the tracks ran between the Irish Sea and a chain of low, green hills. It was a peaceful landscape of rolling pastures and constant wind, where the smoke trails of steam engines blended with the sea mist. The town lived off fishing and the steady rhythm of passing trains that brought news and travellers from London. In the 1,860 seconds, the railways didn't just carry people, they also transported oil, coal, timber, and other flammable goods, often with little regard for safety measures that today would be unthinkable. It was a time of rapid innovation and minimal regulation, when accidents were common. But none would leave such a mark on Wales as the disaster at Abergele. The tragedy struck on the 20th of August 1868, when a passenger train travelling from London to Holyhead approached the Abergele station. At that same moment, farther up the line, several freight wagons loaded with oil and paraffin had been left standing on a slope after a failed manoeuvre at Llandulus station. Without proper brakes, they began to roll downhill uncontrollably. The engineers had almost no time to react. Within seconds, the runaway wagons and the oncoming passenger train met on the same stretch of track. The collision was so violent that the oil tanks exploded, engulfing the carriages in a fireball visible from the sea. The usual calm of Abergele turned instantly into a scene of horror, one that would forever mark the history of British railways. The Abergele disaster was the result of a tragic chain of human errors and technical failures that, combined, ended in catastrophe. On that August 20th, at Llandulus station, railway workers had left several freight wagons loaded with oil and paraffin, both highly flammable materials, parked on a siding track. They were meant to continue toward the port of Holyhead, but a mix-up in the schedule led to them being moved too early. The wagons were not properly secured with handbrakes or wheel chocks, and soon they began to roll downhill toward Abergele, driven by their own weight. No one could stop them. They descended for over 3 kilometers, gathering speed until they slammed head-on into the passenger train, climbing the main line. The impact was instant and devastating. The first 2 carriages of the passenger train were completely destroyed, and the spilled fuel ignited in an explosion that was heard across the valley. Flames engulfed the first-class cars, where entire families were traveling, and within minutes, the train had become a blazing inferno. Local fire brigades, villagers, and even sailors who saw the blaze from the coast rushed to help, but the heat was so intense that no one could approach for nearly an hour. When the fire finally died down, the scene was indescribable. More than 30 bodies burned beyond recognition, reduced to blackened silhouettes amid twisted iron. The press of the time covered the tragedy extensively. The Times called it a Dantesque scene without precedent in the history of British railways. Local papers described the victims in heartbreaking detail. Passengers found locked in embrace, jewelry melted into the metal, and seats turned to charcoal. Of the train crew and engineers, only fragments remained. The image of fire and faceless bodies seared itself into the memory of survivors and rescuers alike, retold for years as something almost supernatural. For many, it felt as if the train had been swallowed by an infernal force. That idea of fire, anonymity, and total destruction became, over time, the core of the legend that soon followed, the tale of the faceless man's ghost, a spirit said by locals to wander the tracks where the horror had once been absolute. In the months following the disaster, the stretch of track between Abergele and Llandulus became a place of silence and reverence. Trains slowed as they passed, and many passengers avoided looking out the windows. Locals claimed that for weeks, the smell of burnt oil and coal still lingered in the air. It was in that uneasy atmosphere caught between fresh memory and lingering fear that the first rumors began to spread. The maintenance workers, tasked with clearing the wreckage and repairing the rails, were the first to speak. They said that at night, they had seen a solitary figure walking along the line, precisely where the collision had taken place. He wore a railwayman's jacket, but his face had no features, just a smooth, blackened surface, like a lump of coal. The story quickly spread among the railway crew's men, who were used to danger and not easily given to superstition. Yet the accounts were so consistent that they soon caught the attention of the local press. In December 1868, the North Wales Chronicle published a short note titled "Mysterious Figure on the Tracks at Abergele," mentioning a spectral railway worker who appears out of the fog and vanishes when approached. It offered no explanation, but the public needed none. They saw it as a sign from beyond. In the cafes and taverns of Denbighshire, people spoke of the Faceless Man, said to be the spirit of one of the engineers who had died trying to stop the train and prevent the tragedy. According to the most popular version, his soul had been trapped between the rails, condemned to relive the moment of impact forever. Over the years, sightings continued. Farmers living near the line claimed to see a bluish light, like an oil lamp, gliding along the tracks before stopping at the crash site and fading away. Others spoke of a long, mournful whistle like that of a steam engine echoing through windless nights when no train was scheduled to pass. In 1872, a conductor on the Chester-Holyhead line reported seeing a human silhouette standing on the rails before dawn. The driver braked hard, but when they illuminated the spot with the headlamp, no one was there. In his report, the man wrote that the figure seemed to burn from within, as though the fire had never entirely consumed it. The sensationalist press of the time seized on the tale, feeding the Victorian fascination with the supernatural. Illustrated magazines like the Illustrated Police News published drawings of the Ghost of Abergele, a man wreathed in flames, standing on the tracks amid smoke and ashes. Editors, aware of the story's appeal, described it as an apparition haunting a place cursed by tragedy. And although many readers dismissed it as superstition, the tale carried a deep emotional weight. The people of Wales had not forgotten the disaster, and the idea that one of the engineers still lingered there watching over the rails brought a kind of comfort. He was the spirit of a man who had done his duty until the end, condemned perhaps to remain, protecting the living so that such a tragedy would never happen again. Over the years, the story of the Faceless Man became an inseparable part of Abergele's collective memory. Locals began to call him simply the Engineer, convinced that his spirit still walked the line every year on the anniversary of the crash. The most repeated version said that the ghost did not seek to frighten anyone, but to fulfill a mission to protect the trains that passed along the same stretch where he had died. Many claimed that on August nights, at the exact hour of the collision, a shadow could be seen walking firmly along the tracks, carrying a lantern that gave off a blue light, like the fire that had once consumed him. If a train approached too quickly, the figure was said to stand before the locomotive, raising the lamp as a warning of danger. The belief ran so deep among railway workers that, for years, engineers slowed down their trains out of respect for the Guardian of Abergele. The phenomenon gained attention across Britain's national press. By the mid-1872s, the Liverpool Mercury and the Manchester Guardian revisited the tale, noting that in Wales, the souls of dead railwaymen never leave their roots. Though written with a hint of irony, the truth was that Victorian society was genuinely fascinated by ghosts. These were the years of spiritualism, of seances, mediums, spectral photography, and the quest to capture images of the beyond. Within that context, the figure of the Faceless Engineer fit perfectly. It represented the fusion of machine, fire, and soul, a powerful metaphor for the human cost of industrial progress. The story grew beyond the tragedy itself and came to symbolize something greater, the sacrifice demanded by a modernity that advanced faster than society could comprehend. Even the newly founded Society for Psychical Research in London, established in 1882, took interest in the Abergele case. In a letter published in 1886, a Welsh railway engineer recounted hearing similar stories among his colleagues, though he had never witnessed the ghost himself. The investigators concluded that there was no physical evidence, yet acknowledged it as one of the most enduring tales in British railway folklore. From then on, The image of the spectral engineer began appearing in pamphlets, short stories, and moral tales sold in stations and marketplaces. The public saw him as a tragic, honorable figure, a man who had done his duty to the very end, whose restless spirit continued to watch over travelers. Over time, the story spread beyond Wales. In Scotland, Cornwall, and northern England, similar tales appeared: apparitions of dead railwaymen, ghostly lights in tunnels, and whistles in the night with no trains to make them. But chroniclers agreed that Abergele was where it all began, the birthplace of Britain's first railway ghost, in a nation that had made the train its proudest symbol of progress. Thus, the faceless engineer became a recurring figure in 19th century popular imagination, a silent warning that speed and ambition always came with a price. And every time a train crossed that fog-covered stretch of northern Wales, wrapped in smoke and steam, the drivers knew, or perhaps simply wanted to believe, that they were not entirely alone. As the new century began, time slowly erased the visible traces of the disaster, but not its memory. The Chester Holyhead line remained in operation, modernized and reinforced, and the steam engines were eventually replaced by diesel locomotives. Yet, veteran railwaymen continued to pass down the tale of the faceless engineer to younger generations. During the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, train drivers still spoke of a specific stretch between Langelas and Abergele, where the tracks seemed to turn cold all of a sudden, as if the air grew heavier and the sound of the engine dulled. Many slowed their trains without quite knowing why. Some claimed that, from the cab, they had seen a faint blue glow in the distance, which vanished as they approached, as if someone were waving a lantern through the fog. These were the final echoes of a legend unwilling to die. Throughout the 20th century, the story shifted from oral rumor to cultural memory. In 1958, on the 90th anniversary of the accident, the North Wales Weekly News published a commemorative feature that included, among the testimonies of witnesses' descendants, a reference to the ghost of the engineer who still walks the line. The article didn't claim the ghost was real, but it admitted that the site still carried a strange sense of unease. In 1968, a century after the crash, British Rail placed a small plaque in memory of the victims with no mention of the ghost, yet visitors began leaving flowers and lanterns at the spot, unknowingly recreating the image of the spectre with his lamp. Even today, on certain August nights, small groups of onlookers gather by the old line to honor the tragedy, and in silence, they stare into the darkness, waiting between the wind and the fog for some sign of the faceless man. The ghost of the Abergele train has outlived its local myth. Historians regard it as the first documented railway ghost in the United Kingdom, and the figure inspired numerous later tales in Victorian fiction and Welsh folklore collections. More than a mere vengeful spirit, it embodies the collective fear that accompanied 19th century technological progress, the fear that the machine, symbol of advancement, might one day turn uncontrollable. In him, elements of guilt, sacrifice, and remembrance intertwine. Even today, British railway workers mention him as a silent symbol of respect for colleagues who died in service. Because beyond the supernatural, the story of the faceless man of Abergele reminds us that every track, every tunnel, and every iron machine carries not only the sound of progress, but also the echo of those left behind. The hidden inhabitant of Glamis Castle, Scotland. In the heart of Angus County, in northern Scotland, stands one of the most mysterious castles in the British Isles, Glamis Castle. Its history dates back to the 14th century, when the Leon family, ancestors of the current Earls of Strathmore, made it their principal residence. Over the centuries, Glamis became far more than a noble estate. It was a symbol of Scottish feudal power, a stage for alliances, intrigues, and long-kept silences. Its reddish stone walls, pointed towers, and endless corridors gave it a reputation for being impenetrable, both physically and morally. Each generation of the family expanded and reinforced it, adding new wings and chambers, until it grew into a structure so vast that visitors often claimed to lose their sense of direction inside. But the mystery went far beyond its architecture. Since the 17th century, rumors had circulated about a sealed room, a hidden space omitted from all known floor plans, one that only the heads of the family were said to know about. Surviving documents from the period hint at something unusual. In the official inventories of the castle, reviewed during each succession, one detail consistently stands out. Among the precise listings of halls, libraries, and bedrooms, one room is always missing. Its size, location, and contents were never recorded. Only the earls and their heirs were said to know what it contained. No one else, not the servants, not the stewards, not even the architects had access. And when someone dared to ask about it, the answer was always the same. There are rooms that are not to be visited. Over time, that omission became tradition, and the tradition turned into legend. Locals whispered that on moonless nights, lights could be seen glowing in the castle towers while the rest of the household slept. They said that an entire wing had been sealed off for generations, and that anyone who tried to approach it found doors with no keyholes and corridors ending in solid walls. No one knew what lay behind them, but everyone agreed on one thing. The secret of Glamis was not gold, nor a hidden chamber, but a living presence, something or someone meant to remain unseen. And that silence, carefully guarded by the Strathmore family for centuries, became the source of one of the most chilling legends in all of Scotland. The origin of the mystery surrounding Glamis Castle traces back to a story that the Lyon family has never confirmed nor denied. According to 18th century oral accounts, at some point in the family line, a legitimate heir, the firstborn son of the Earl of Strathmore, was born, only for his existence to be carefully erased from all official records. The child was said to have been born with such severe deformities that it was deemed impossible for him to be seen in public. Later descriptions collected by Victorian travellers and Scottish writers spoke of a grotesquely misshapen body, scarred skin, and a face so deformed that, they said, one could not look upon it without feeling terror. In an era when physical appearance was tied to honour and the purity of bloodlines, such a birth was considered not only a family disgrace, but also a social threat. And so, the family allegedly decided to hide him, not to kill him, but to keep him alive inside the castle, far from the eyes of the world. The few servants who knew the secret, so the legend goes, were handpicked and sworn to absolute silence under penalty of death. Their duty was to care for the prisoner, to feed him, clean his quarters, and watch over him, allowing no contact with anyone else. That room would be the same one that for generations remained missing from every inventory and sealed in every floor plan. The supposed heir lived without name or title, cut off from all outside life, growing old without ever being seen. Tales say he was fed through a small hatch, or that his door was opened only once a day for a few seconds to pass in food and light. No one knew how many years he survived, or whether he ever understood why he had been condemned to such isolation. When the rumor finally reached the nearby village, locals began to call him simply the hidden inhabitant. As the years went on, the silence surrounding the secret grew heavier. Visitors staying at the castle reported inaccessible areas, corridors that led nowhere, and doors that never opened. On long winter nights, some servants claimed to hear shuffling footsteps, as if someone moved with great difficulty, or a slow, rhythmic thud echoing from deep within the walls. Others said they found empty trays left in places no one should have passed. When asked, the stewards gave evasive answers. At Glamis, the walls listen more than they speak. For the nobility, the secret was a shame to be locked away. For the common folk, it was proof that the castle was alive, haunted not by spirits, but by a human presence, tragic and forgotten, a victim of the very bloodline to which he belonged. Thus, the mystery of Glamis transformed from a story of concealment into a legend of guilt and silence, where the horror did not come from the supernatural, but from the cruelty of those who chose to hide what they could not bear to accept. As generations passed, the rumors about the hidden inhabitants spread far beyond the walls of Glamis Castle. Peasants from nearby villages told stories that varied in detail, but always shared the same core: a human being, born of noble blood, condemned to live in darkness. On winter nights, when the wind battered the towers and the servants fastened the shutters, it was said that one could hear dull knocks, muffled groans, or even a long, mournful cry, the sound of someone who had never known rest. The oldest accounts spoke of lights flickering in deserted towers and the metallic creak of a lock turning slowly, though no one was supposed to have the key. Servants, fearful of losing their jobs, or worse, never spoke openly about it. Yet each time one left the castle's service, the stories multiplied. By the 19th century, when Scotland had become a destination for romantic travellers and the curious, the mystery of Glamis resurfaced with new strength. Victorian writers and chroniclers, captivated by the Gothic and the inexplicable, began collecting the testimonies of locals. In 1820, the Scottish poet Robert Chambers made an indirect reference to the castle in his travel notes, describing it as a fortress that harbours a secret the living may not reveal. In the years that followed, British curiosity magazines and local newspapers published their own versions of the myth, each one more disturbing than the last. Some told of a monstrous child kept alive for decades. Others claimed that after his death, his body had been sealed behind the walls to hide the family's shame forever. None of these versions were ever officially denied, and the Lyon family's silence only served to fuel the legend. The Victorian era, with its obsession for haunted houses and buried family secrets, turned Glamis Castle into one of the most mysterious places in the United Kingdom. Foreign visitors lucky enough to stay there spoke of a heavy atmosphere, endless corridors, and a constant feeling of being watched. Some claimed that servants warned them not to walk alone at night, and that certain wings of the castle remained locked even during public gatherings. The myth had by then become part of Glamis's identity. It was no longer just an aristocratic residence, but a symbol of hereditary secrecy, a place where the inexplicable lived alongside the respectable, where lineage and shame shared the same walls. Thus, the figure of the hidden inhabitant evolved from a rural rumour into a national legend, a dark reflection of Britain's noble families and of everything that was kept hidden behind their walls. Over time, the story of the hidden inhabitant ceased to be just a rumour and began to appear in the accounts of those who claimed to have heard the secret directly from members of the Strathmore family. By the mid-19th century, several distinguished visitors had been received at Glamis Castle, among them Scottish nobles, writers, and military officers. Some of these guests agreed on one disturbing detail. One of the earls, in a rare moment of confidence, had allegedly hinted at the existence of a forbidden room, known only to the head of the family and his heir. One of those witnesses, according to a private letter published years later, recalled hearing this exact phrase: "In Glamis, there is a door that only two men may open, and when they do, they wish they never had." No one ever confirmed the statement, but the mere fact that it circulated among the Scottish aristocracy gave the mystery new weight. The legend was no longer a peasant superstition, it had become an aristocratic secret, whispered only among those privileged enough to know. Tradition held that upon reaching adulthood, each new Earl of Strathmore was taken in private to the sealed room where the truth was revealed to him. There, according to rumour, he was shown something he was bound to keep secret until his death. Some claimed it was a hidden portrait. Others said it was a body preserved in a secret chamber, and the boldest whispered that the room was still inhabited by someone or something human, yet unrecognisable. From that day on, the Earl would swear an oath of silence, and the secret would be passed to his successor when the time came. No one outside the family ever knew what was seen within that room. Victorian chroniclers agreed on one curious pattern. After the initiation, the airs of Glamis seemed to change. They became quieter, more solemn, as if they had seen something that altered the way they understood life itself. After the supposed death of the prisoner, sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century, reports of inexplicable phenomena began to emerge within the castle. Servants spoke of footsteps echoing through empty corridors, of moans in the night that seemed to come from within the walls, and of doors that opened on their own in the north wing, the oldest part of the building. Some witnesses claimed that, while walking through certain hallways, they felt a sudden change in the air, as if the cold were radiating from the stone itself. At times, the candles flickered without reason, and animals refused to enter specific rooms. Unlike other noble families, the owners of Glamis never openly denied these stories. They maintained absolute discretion, merely remarking that the castle had its own ways. That calculated silence is what kept the legend alive and made it even more powerful. It gave rise to the haunting idea that the true horror of Glamis Castle was not supernatural at all, but far too human to ever be told. Over time, the story of the hidden inhabitant ceased to be just a rumour and began to appear in the accounts of those who claimed to have heard the secret directly from members of the Strathmore family. By the mid-19th century, several distinguished visitors had been received at Glamis Castle, among them Scottish nobles, writers, and military officers. Some of these guests agreed on one disturbing detail. One of the earls, in a rare moment of confidence, had allegedly hinted at the existence of a forbidden room, known only to the head of the family and his heir. One of those witnesses, according to a private letter published years later, recalled hearing this exact phrase: "In Glamis, there is a door that only two men may open, and when they do, they wish they never had." No one ever confirmed this statement, but the mere fact that it circulated among the Scottish aristocracy gave the mystery new weight. The legend was no longer a peasant superstition, it had become an aristocratic secret, whispered only among those privileged enough to know. Tradition held that upon reaching adulthood, each new Earl of Strathmore was taken in private to the sealed room where the truth was revealed to him. There, according to rumour, he was shown something he was bound to keep secret until his death. Some claimed it was a hidden portrait. Others said it was a body preserved in a secret chamber, and the boldest whispered that the room was still inhabited by someone or something human, yet unrecognisable. From that day on, the Earl would swear an oath of silence, and the secret would be passed to his successor when the time came. No one outside the family ever knew what was seen within that room. Victorian chroniclers agreed on one curious pattern. After the initiation, the airs of Glamis seemed to change. They became quieter, more solemn, as if they had seen something that altered the way they understood life itself. After the supposed death of the prisoner, sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century, reports of inexplicable phenomena began to emerge within the castle. Servants spoke of footsteps echoing through empty corridors, of moans in the night that seemed to come from within the walls, and of doors that opened on their own in the north wing, the oldest part of the building. Some witnesses claimed that, while walking through certain hallways, they felt a sudden change in the air, as if the cold were radiating from the stone itself. At times, the candles flickered without reason, and animals refused to enter specific rooms. Unlike other noble families, the owners of Glamis never openly denied these stories. They maintained absolute discretion, merely remarking that the castle had its own ways. That calculated silence is what kept the legend alive and made it even more powerful. It gave rise to the haunting idea that the true horror of Glamis Castle was not supernatural at all, but far too human to ever be told. The death of Prince Carlos, Spain. By the mid-16th century, the Spanish Empire stood at the height of its power. Under the reign of Philip II, Spain ruled territories stretching from the Netherlands to the Indies, from Naples to the Americas. In the royal palaces of Valladolid and Madrid, the court projected an image of order, devotion, and divine authority. Yet behind that appearance of perfection lay a hidden fracture, an intimate and silent conflict that would grow into a dynastic tragedy. The story of Prince Don Carlos of Austria, only son of the king, heir to the mightiest throne in the world, and one of the most disturbing figures of the 16th century. Don Carlos was born in Valladolid in 1545, the child of Philip II and Maria Manuela of Portugal. His birth was celebrated across Europe. He was the grandson of Emperor Charles V, the living promise of the Habsburg legacy. But the joy was short-lived. His mother died only days after childbirth, leaving the infant motherless and in the care of doctors, nurses, and tutors. From his earliest years, chroniclers recorded troubling behavior, violent fits of rage, mood swings, and a mind that oscillated between brilliance and instability. Some medical notes described him as frail, prone to fevers and fainting spells. Others hinted at a psyche disturbed by solitude. In a court where every gesture was observed and judged, the young prince's temperament became a source of unease. Those who educated Don Carlos painted a portrait of a boy both gifted and volatile, capable of affection and cruelty within the same hour. At times, he showed generosity, curiosity, and charm. At others, he was impulsive, cruel, and consumed by envy. He detested protocol, mocked religious ceremonies, and seemed obsessed with the purity of his royal blood, as though the Habsburg lineage itself justified his defiance. Philip II, a man of relentless discipline and cold reason, found his son's instability intolerable. To him, Carlos represented not hope but disorder. The emotional distance between father and son deepened into distrust. At the Alcázar of Madrid, whispers grew. The future of Spain lay in the hands of a prince too unstable to rule and a father too rigid to love him. No one knew it yet, but that chasm between them would determine both their fates. One imprisoned by duty, the other by his own madness. In 1562, Prince Don Carlos was 17 years old, and his mental state had become a matter of grave concern within the Spanish court. He was impulsive, suspicious, and prone to violent fits of rage. During one of these episodes, while arguing with a servant in the palace of Valladolid, he suffered an accident that would change his life forever. He fell down a steep stone staircase, striking his head violently against a step. For several days, he lay unconscious, his face disfigured, his breathing shallow. The physicians feared for his life. Philip II, desperate, summoned the best doctors in the kingdom and ordered that masses be said for his recovery. When the young man finally awoke, it seemed that he had survived, but he was no longer the same. The medical chronicles of the time describe a slow and erratic recovery. He was subjected to bloodletting, purges, and ointments, the standard remedies of the 16th century, none of which improved his condition. From that moment on, Don Carlos's personality changed dramatically. He became more aggressive, more distrustful, and increasingly unstable. Foreign ambassadors reported that he suffered from fits of fury and, in his delusions, believed himself the victim of palace conspiracies. His memory grew fragmented and he barely slept. At night, he would wander through the corridors, muttering to himself or pounding on the walls. The head injury had clearly left neurological damage, loss of self-control, anxiety attacks, and erratic behavior that worsened with time. His already fragile relationship with his father collapsed completely. Philip II, a man of cold logic and deep religious conviction, saw in his son everything he feared most: irrationality, disorder, and weakness. He began to exclude him from affairs of state, officially citing health reasons, though in truth, it was mistrust. Don Carlos, for his part, interpreted the exclusion as a betrayal. Chroniclers described him spying on his tutors, threatening servants, and hoarding weapons in his chambers. On one occasion, he attempted to stab the Duke of Alba. On another, he threw a page out a window for refusing an order. The court began to fear him. Servants were forbidden to approach him without permission, and audiences with his father became rare and brief. As his behavior grew increasingly erratic, the prince came to be seen as a threat to the stability of the realm. Spain needed a strong, composed heir, capable of preserving the unity of the empire, but Don Carlos had become a young man consumed by paranoia and rage. Philip II, obsessed with moral and political order, decided to isolate his son, controlling every aspect of his life, his readings, his walks, even his meals. Outwardly, it seemed a medical precaution. In reality, it was the beginning of a political and personal imprisonment, one that would soon end in tragedy. As Don Carlos's physical and mental health declined, his behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. He grew obsessed with the idea of escaping his father's control and claiming a political role that no one was willing to grant him. By 1567, rumors about his intentions were spreading throughout the court. Several ambassadors, especially those from Flanders, reported that the prince had expressed a desire to travel north to liberate the Flemish rebels from his father's rule. According to his own words, he sought revenge against the Duke of Alba, whom he blamed for turning the king against him. Other reports suggested that he had attempted to obtain weapons and funds to organize his escape. The notion that the heir to the Spanish throne might ally himself with the empire's enemies was unthinkable and intolerable. The prince's conduct became alarming. He would spend hours locked in his chambers, talking to himself and plotting his flight. At times, he demanded that his servants bring him travel clothes and saddled horses. When they refused, he flew into violent rages. One night, he tried to force open the Duke of Alba's door with a dagger in hand. On another occasion, he burst into his father's quarters, shouting that imperial blood was not meant to live in captivity. These incidents were recorded by Juan de Mariana and in the reports of several European diplomats. The Royal Council concluded that the prince now posed a danger not only to the security of the kingdom, but also to the personal safety of the king himself. Philip II's decision was as cold as it was final. On the night of the 18th of January 1568, he personally ordered the arrest of his son. Accompanied by a small group of nobles and trusted guards, the king walked to the prince's quarters in the Alcázar of Madrid. The scene would never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Philip entered without a word. Don Carlos, startled, believed his father had come to reconcile. Instead, the king confiscated his weapons, his books, and every metal object in the room. The windows were sealed and the doors guarded day and night. Thus began the confinement of the heir to the Spanish throne, an imprisonment that would last 6 months and plunge the young man into total despair. The conditions of his captivity were severe. Visits were forbidden. Only a few doctors and servants were allowed to see him. All objects that could be used for self-harm or escape were removed. He slept in a nearly bare room, watched constantly through a small slit in the door. Contemporary documents suggest that his food was rationed and his every movement monitored. Some accounts claim that, in his desperation, he attempted to starve himself, convinced that his father had condemned him to oblivion. Soon, whispers filled the halls of the Alcazar, tales of his screams, his fevered prayers, and his mad ramblings through the night. What had begun as a preventive measure became a slow death behind closed doors, a palace tragedy buried in silence. During the first months of 1568, Prince Don Carlos's health collapsed completely. Inside his guarded chambers at the Alcazar of Madrid, the heir to the most powerful empire in Europe was slowly wasting away. The reports of the royal physicians Francisco de Olivares and Cristobal de Vega describe a grim picture. Persistent fevers, vomiting, weight loss, and recurring delirium. The young man refused food, slept little, and grew increasingly hostile toward his attendants. He would not allow himself to be examined, convinced that his doctors were trying to poison him. In his final months, he spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in broken, feverish sentences. Prayers one moment, curses the next, as if addressing an unseen presence. Servants later claimed that he would spend hours staring into mirrors, certain that spies or demons sent by his father were watching him from the other side. The isolation had shattered his mind. Physicians tried to force him to eat, resorting to purgatives and tonics, but to no effect. Some records from the royal household note that Philip II ordered every effort be made for his health, though other sources insist the king forbade direct medical intervention to avoid worsening his son's condition. In the stale, humid air of his sealed chamber, the prince began to suffer from liver inflammation and unquenchable thirst. The windows remained boarded up, and the heat was suffocating. By June 1568, witnesses said he looked like an old man long before his time. He was only 23 years old, yet those who saw him described a wasted body, hollow eyes, and sallow skin. In the early hours of the 24th of July, 1568, at 2 in the morning, Don Carlos died. The official record states only, he expired from continuous fevers and weakness of the stomach. There was no autopsy and no public ceremony. His body was quietly wrapped and taken to the monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial, where it was buried under strict orders of silence. King Philip II did not attend the funeral. Only a handful of clerics and officials accompanied the coffin. The bells of Madrid tolled without explanation, and word of his death spread through the city like a forbidden rumor. Many believed he had been poisoned. Others whispered that he had been starved to death. The European embassies sent conflicting reports in Rome. It was called a suspicious death. In Vienna, a pious punishment. And in London, a reversed regicide, a father killing his own son in the name of power. Europe's reaction was immediate. In the Protestant courts, pamphlets denounced Philip II as a tyrant, a new Herod who had sacrificed his son for the sake of the empire. The king's defenders, meanwhile, claimed it was an act of reason of state, a necessary measure to preserve order from an heir both unstable and dangerous. Through it all, Philip II remained silent. He never spoke publicly of what had happened, nor allowed anyone else to. In his personal writings, he left only a single, chilling sentence: "I have done what I must." From that day on, the name of Don Carlos was erased from official records and his memory condemned to darkness. After his death, the name of Don Carlos of Austria was officially erased from the history of the Spanish monarchy, but not from Europe's memory. The silence of Philip II only fed what he feared most: rumor. In the months that followed, ambassadors in Madrid sent conflicting reports about the true cause of the prince's death. Some claimed he had been deliberately starved as punishment. Others spoke of poison administered gradually under the guise of medical treatment. The darkest accounts suggested that the king himself had ordered him denied food until his body and will were broken. The truth, as so often in royal affairs, was buried under the weight of state secrecy. And within that silence, a legend took root, that of the martyred prince, victim of his father's absolute power. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, foreign chroniclers turned the case into a parable of Spanish despotism. In France and Germany, pamphlets portrayed Philip II as an unyielding monarch, enslaved by his religious fanaticism. But it was the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism, that gave the story new life. In 1787, the playwright Friedrich Schiller published his celebrated tragedy, Don Carlos, Infant von Spanien, depicting the prince as a sensitive idealist crushed beneath a cruel father's tyranny. Decades later, Giuseppe Verdi transformed Schiller's work into his opera, Don Carlo 1867, in which the doomed heir became a symbol of freedom against oppression. Thus, the real Don Carlos, unstable, sick, and imprisoned, was reborn as a literary figure, the eternal rebellious youth who defies power in the name of love and justice. Today, the story of Prince Don Carlos remains shrouded in the same ambiguity that surrounded it from the beginning. To some historians, he was a mentally ill man, destroyed by an age that lacked medical understanding. To others, he was a political victim, a pawn sacrificed by his father in the name of order and reason of state. His tomb in El Escorial remains sealed and unadorned. Only a simple inscription bears his name, no dates, no honors. Yet his shadow still lingers in the history of Spain, the heir born to rule who was consumed by the very power he was meant to inherit. A symbol of the limits of absolutism and of the price paid when duty outweighs blood. Because in the end, the tragedy of Don Carlos was not madness, but silence.